Christmas week 1891, Montana Territory. Two women who'd never met before today huddle in a wind-carved cave, their stage lost to a blizzard that swallowed the trail whole. Pearl Fletcher, a schoolmarm with grit in her bones, and Josie Lane, a preacher's daughter with music in her soul, came west as mail-order brides. Now they're clutching a tattered quilt and a dying lantern, whispering prayers that feel like their last. The storm howls like a living thing, and the cold cuts through their wool coats like a blade. They've heard stories of folks found frozen come spring, and tonight that fate seems certain. But when a lantern's glow suddenly spills into their stone shelter, they wonder if they're seeing an angel or death itself. Boone Calder, heir to the Silver Spur spread, emerges from the white furrier man, whose wealth is matched only by the loneliness he's carried since fire claimed his fiancée. But will rescuing these two women from the storm save them all from the deeper cold that settled in their hearts? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wind's fury seemed to part before Boone Calder's broad shoulders as he led the two shivering women from their stone refuge. His lantern cast dancing shadows across the snow-laden pines that bent like supplicants before the storm's wrath. Pearl Fletcher's teeth chattered so violently she could barely speak, while Josie Lane's fingers had gone numb around the edges of the quilt they shared between them. "Not much further now," Boone called over his shoulder, his voice carrying the calm authority of a man who'd weathered many such nights. His breath formed white clouds that the wind snatched away before they could fully form. The women followed in his wake, their boots sinking deep into drifts that reached past their knees. Pearl tried to study this stranger who'd appeared like Providence itself. Even in the storm's chaos, she could see he was a man of substance. His coat was fine wool, his boots well-made leather, and his bearing spoke of education and means. But it was his eyes that caught her attention when he'd turned to help them from the cave. They held a depth of sorrow that matched her own, though she sensed his ran deeper than any disappointment over a faithless groom. Josie noticed different things about their rescuer. The gentle way he'd offered his arm when she'd stumbled, the patience with which he'd waited for them to gather their meager belongings, the careful manner in which he'd shielded them from the worst of the wind. Her father had always said you could judge a man's character by how he treated those who could do nothing for him in return. The outline of a great house emerged from the white curtain of snow, like a ship materializing from fog. Calder House rose 3 stories into the Montana night, its windows glowing warm and golden against the storm. Smoke curled from multiple chimneys, and the scent of burning pine and oak promised heat and safety beyond imagination. "Welcome to the Silver Spur," Boone said, though his words were nearly lost in the wind's howl. He led them up wide steps to a covered porch that wrapped around the house like welcoming arms. The sudden absence of wind felt like a blessing as he opened the heavy oak door. The warmth hit them like a physical embrace. Pearl gasped as feeling began to return to her fingers, while Josie's eyes filled with tears of relief. They stood dripping in the grand foyer, taking in polished hardwood floors, a sweeping staircase with carved banisters, and walls lined with paintings of Western landscapes. "Mrs. Kowalski," Boone called, and moments later a sturdy woman in her 50s appeared, wiping her hands on a flour-dusted apron. Her graying hair was pulled back in a practical bun, and her eyes held the warmth of someone who'd spent her life caring for others. "Good Lord above!" she exclaimed, taking in the bedraggled state of the two women. "You found them, Mr. Boone. Praise be. They need hot baths, warm clothes, and something substantial to eat," Boone said, helping Pearl out of her sodden coat. "I'll stable Ranger and see to the fire in the main room." "Mrs." Kowalski clucked her tongue and immediately took charge. "Come along, dears. We'll have you sorted in no time. Mr. Boone, you change out of those wet things before you catch your death." Pearl found her voice at last. "We're much obliged, Mr. Calder. I'm Pearl Fletcher, and this is Miss Josie Lane. We were traveling to—" "Time enough for talk when you're warm and fed," Boone interrupted gently. "Mrs. Kowalski will take good care of you." The housekeeper led them up the grand staircase, her commentary a steady stream of comfort. "Been keeping fires burning in the guest rooms, just hoping Mr. Boone would find you safe. Terrible thing, being caught in a storm like that. But you're safe now, safe as houses." She opened the door to a room that might have belonged in a fine hotel back east. A four-poster bed dominated the space, draped in deep blue velvet that matched the curtains. A fireplace crackled merrily, casting dancing light across Persian rugs and polished furniture. Fresh towels and a nightgown had been laid out on the bed. "This is for you, Miss Fletcher," Mrs. Kowalski said. "Miss Lane, you're just next door. Hot water's already drawn in the bathing rooms. I'll have soup and bread sent up shortly." When Pearl was finally alone, she sank into a chair by the fire and let the reality of their situation wash over her. This morning she'd been a mail-order bride, traveling to meet her intended husband. Now she was a guest in the home of a wealthy rancher who'd saved her life. The events felt surreal, like something from one of the penny novels she'd once confiscated from her students. She thought of Thomas Whitmore, the man who'd wooed her through carefully penned letters over the past 6 months. His promises of a teaching position in his growing town, a comfortable home, and a partnership in building something meaningful together. The letters that had convinced her to leave her position in Chicago and invest her life savings in this Western adventure. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. "Miss Fletcher, it's Josie. Might I come in?" Pearl opened the door to find her fellow traveler transformed. Gone was the bedraggled woman from the cave, replaced by someone who looked like she belonged in this grand house. The borrowed dress, while simple, suited her delicate features. Her dark hair had been brushed until it shone, and her cheeks glowed pink from the warmth. "I couldn't stop thinking about our situation," Josie said, settling into the chair opposite Pearl. "We've found ourselves in quite the predicament, haven't we?" Pearl nodded, appreciating the other woman's directness. "I keep trying to understand how we ended up here. This morning we were both traveling to meet our intended husbands. Now we're guests of a stranger." "A very kind stranger," Josie observed. "Did you notice his eyes? There's pain there, deep pain. I wonder what tragedy shaped him." "I noticed that too," Pearl admitted. "He has the bearing of a man who's known loss, but also the strength of someone who survived it." They sat in companionable silence for a moment, listening to the storm rage outside. Finally, Josie spoke again. "Pearl, I need to tell you something about my situation. The man I came to marry, I'm beginning to suspect he might not exist at all." Pearl's attention sharpened. "What do you mean?" "The letters were always vague about his circumstances. No specific address, no mention of friends or family. And the matrimonial broker who arranged everything, I never met him in person. Everything was handled through correspondence." A cold dread settled in Pearl's stomach. "The broker's name?" "Ezra Blackwood. He ran an advertisement in the Chicago papers, promising to match refined ladies with successful Western gentlemen." Pearl's blood ran cold. "That's impossible. Ezra Blackwood arranged my match with Thomas Whitmore." The two women stared at each other as the implications sank in. Their separate journeys had been orchestrated by the same man, leading them to the same stage, the same storm, the same cave. "But why?" Josie whispered. "What possible reason could he have for deceiving us both?" Before Pearl could answer, Mrs. Kowalski appeared with a tray of steaming soup and fresh bread. "Mr. Boone asks if you ladies would join him in the main room when you're ready. He's got questions about your journey, and frankly, so do I. It's not often we get two young ladies traveling together without proper escort." Pearl and Josie exchanged glances. They had questions of their own, starting with why a man like Boone Calder had been riding fence lines in a blizzard instead of sitting safely by his fire. An hour later, they descended the grand staircase to find Boone waiting in what Mrs. Kowalski had called the main room. The space was magnificent high ceilings with exposed beams, a stone fireplace large enough to stand in, and furniture that spoke of both comfort and quality. Boone had changed into dry clothes, and Pearl was struck again by his presence. He was younger than she'd first thought, perhaps in his early 30s, with the kind of quiet strength that came from facing life's challenges head-on. He'd been studying something in his hands, a small, leather-bound journal that he quickly closed when they entered. Pearl caught a glimpse of pressed flowers between the pages before he set it aside. "Please sit," he said, gesturing to chairs arranged near the fire. "I hope you're feeling better." "Much better, thanks to your hospitality," Pearl replied, settling into a chair that embraced her like a gentle hug. "We owe you our lives, Mr. Calder." "Boone, please, and you owe me nothing. I'm just grateful I found you when I did." He paused, studying them with those perceptive eyes. "Though I admit to being curious about your circumstances, two ladies traveling alone in winter, it's unusual, to say the least." Josie spoke up. "We're mail-order brides, Mr. Calder, or rather, we were supposed to be. We were traveling to meet our intended husbands when the storm hit." "Supposed to be?" Boone's eyebrows rose slightly. Pearl leaned forward. "We've discovered that our arrangements were made by the same broker, a man named Ezra Blackwood, and we're beginning to suspect we've been deceived." Boone's expression darkened at the mention of the name. "Blackwood," he repeated, his voice taking on an edge. "I know that name. He's not a matrimonial broker, he's a confidence man and worse. I testified against him in a cattle-rustling case 3 years ago. He should be in prison." The room fell silent, except for the crackling of the fire. Pearl felt the last of her hopes for her planned new life crumble like autumn leaves. "Then there is no Thomas Whitmore?" "And no Jonathan Mills," Josie added quietly, naming her own supposed intended. Boone's jaw tightened. "I'm afraid not. Blackwood's scheme usually involves taking women's savings and abandoning them somewhere remote. The fact that you both ended up on the same stage suggests something more elaborate." Pearl stood and moved to the window, looking out at the storm that had brought them here. "He took everything I had, my savings, my position, my future. I have nothing left." "Neither do I," Josie said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I gave him my inheritance from my grandmother, money I'd saved for years. I have nothing to return to." Boone was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving between the two women. When he finally spoke, his voice was gentle but firm. "Then you'll stay here." Both women turned to stare at him. "Mr. Calder," Pearl began. "Boone," he corrected. "And I'm not making the offer out of pity. This ranch needs what you both have to offer. Pearl, Mrs. Kowalski mentioned you're a trained teacher. The ranch hand's children need schooling, and I've been trying to find someone qualified for months. And Josie, if you're willing, this house could use music. It's been too quiet for too long." Pearl felt tears prick her eyes. "We couldn't impose." "You wouldn't be imposing, you'd be helping. The storm will keep the trails impassable for weeks, maybe months. By the time spring comes, you'll have had time to decide what you want to do with your futures." Josie's voice was small but hopeful. "You truly want us to stay?" Boone picked up his journal again, his fingers tracing the leather cover. "This house has been too empty since." He paused, then continued, "Since I lost someone dear to me. Your presence today reminded me that homes are meant to be filled with life and laughter. If you're willing to stay, I'd be honored to have you." Pearl looked at Josie, seeing her own mixture of gratitude and uncertainty reflected in the other woman's eyes. They were strangers thrown together by circumstance, but they were also survivors. And perhaps, in this grand house with its velvet curtains and crackling fires, they might find something better than what they'd lost. "We accept," Pearl said, speaking for both of them, "with gratitude." As if summoned by their agreement, the wind outside seemed to settle into a gentler rhythm. The storm would continue, but within these walls, 3 wounded souls had found unexpected shelter. Dawn brought no relief from the storm. If anything, the wind had grown more vicious during the night, driving snow against the windows with such force that ice crystals formed on the inside of the glass. Pearl woke to the sound of it, a constant howling that seemed to penetrate the very bones of the house. She dressed in the clothes Mrs. Kowalski had provided, a simple grey wool dress that fit well enough, and made her way downstairs. The house felt different in daylight, less magical perhaps, but more solid and real. She could hear voices from the kitchen and followed the sound, finding Boone and Mrs. Kowalski deep in conversation over coffee and biscuits. "The north pasture fence is down for certain," Boone was saying. "I could see the posts leaning even through the snow. We'll lose cattle if this keeps up." "Morning will come again, Mr. Boone," Mrs. Kowalski said in her practical way. "Storm can't last forever, and you've weathered worse." They looked up as Pearl entered, and Boone rose from his chair. "Good morning. I hope you slept well." "Better than I have in weeks," Pearl admitted. The bed was wonderfully comfortable, and the quiet. She paused as another gust of wind rattled the windows. Well, the indoor quiet was peaceful. Mrs. Kowalski poured her coffee without being asked, adding cream and sugar as if she'd been serving Pearl for years rather than hours. "Miss Josie's still sleeping, poor lamb. Yesterday took it out of both of you." Pearl settled at the table, grateful for the warmth and normalcy of the kitchen. "Mr. Calder, Boone, about your offer last night. Are you certain? We're strangers after all." "Sometimes strangers make the best arrangements," Boone replied. "No expectations, no disappointed assumptions, just honest need met with honest capability." Before Pearl could respond, Josie appeared in the doorway, her hair still mussed from sleep. She wore a blue dress that brought out her eyes, and despite their circumstances, she looked younger and more hopeful than she had the night before. "I smelled coffee," she said with a shy smile, "and heard voices. I hope I'm not intruding." "Never," Mrs. Kowalski declared, already reaching for another cup. "Sit yourself down, dear. I'll have breakfast ready shortly." As they ate, Pearl found herself studying her companions. Boone had the weathered hands of a working man, despite his obvious wealth, and there was something about the way he held himself that suggested military service, or at least hard-won discipline. Josie ate quietly, but Pearl noticed how her fingers moved against the table as if playing an invisible piano. "I should send word to town," Boone said eventually. "Let folks know you're safe. Was anyone expecting you?" Pearl's stomach tightened. "Thomas Whitmore was supposed to meet our stage in Bitterroot Falls. When we don't arrive." "He doesn't exist, remember," Josie said gently. "None of them do." The reality of their situation settled over Pearl like a lead blanket. She reached into her reticule and pulled out a leather portfolio. "I have all his letters here. 6 months of correspondence. How could they seem so real if the man doesn't exist?" Boone held out his hand. "May I?" Pearl hesitated, then handed over the letters. Boone read through them quickly, his expression growing darker with each page. Finally, he set them down and looked at both women with something like anger in his eyes. "These are well-crafted," he said, "too well-crafted. Someone spent considerable time creating this fiction." He picked up one letter and pointed to the header. "Look at this letterhead. Whitmore Dry Goods and General Store, Bitterroot Falls. Professional quality, expensive paper. That's what convinced me he was legitimate," Pearl said. "That and the way he wrote about wanting a partner in both business and life, someone educated who could help him bring culture and learning to his growing town." Josie pulled out her own collection of letters. Jonathan Mills wrote similarly. He claimed to own a small ranch and wanted a wife who could bring music and refinement to frontier life. Boone examined Josie's correspondence with the same careful attention, same quality paper, same professional appearance. But look here, he held both sets of letters up to the light. Same watermark. They were printed at the same shop, probably at the same time. The implications hit Pearl like a physical blow. He planned this, all of it, but why go to such elaborate lengths? "I don't know," Boone admitted, "but I intend to find out. Blackwood's schemes usually involve more than just theft. He's patient, methodical. This level of preparation suggests something bigger." Mrs. Kowalski had been listening while she worked, and now she turned from the stove with a wooden spoon in her hand. "Seems to me you ladies are better off here than wherever that scoundrel intended you to end up." Pearl looked around the warm kitchen at these people who had shown her more kindness in 12 hours than she'd received in months of correspondence with her supposed intended. "I'm beginning to think you're right, Mrs. Kowalski." After breakfast, Boone led them on a tour of the house. It was even grander than Pearl had imagined either. Library with floor-to-ceiling shelves, a music room with a piano that made Josie gasp with delight, and bedrooms enough for a large family. But it was clear that for all its size and luxury, it was a lonely place. "My father built this house for entertaining," Boone explained as they stood in the formal dining room with its table for 20. "He envisioned grand parties, business dinners, celebrations. After my mother died when I was 12, he lost interest in such things. And after he passed 5 years ago," he paused, looking out the window at the storm. "Well, I haven't been much for company either." Pearl found herself curious about the tragedy that had marked him. She'd noticed the way he touched that leather journal, the careful way he spoke of the past. But she didn't pry. Everyone deserved their private griefs. In the music room, Josie ran her fingers over the piano keys with reverence. "It's beautiful, a Steinway." "Yes, my mother's. She was quite accomplished. I haven't heard it played in years." Josie pressed a few keys, creating a simple melody that filled the room with unexpected warmth. "It's perfectly tuned. Someone's been caring for it." "Mrs. Kowalski insists," Boone said with a slight smile. "She says a house without music is just a building." They ended the tour in what Boone called his study masculine room, with leather chairs, hunting trophies, and a massive desk covered with ranch paperwork. Maps of the Silver Spur covered one wall, showing the impressive scope of the operation. 15,000 acres, Boone explained, noting Pearl's interest. "My grandfather homesteaded the original section. My father expanded it, and I've added what I could. It's good land, well-watered, with mountain pastures for summer grazing." "It must keep you very busy," Pearl observed. "It does, especially now with winter pressing hard and the spring carving season approaching. That's why your offer to teach the children is so welcome, Pearl. The ranch hands worry about their young ones' education, but I haven't had time to establish a proper school." Pearl felt a stirring of excitement. "How many children?" 8, ranging from 6 to 14. Bright kids, eager to learn. They've been making do with whatever their parents can teach them, but they deserve better. Where would I hold classes? Boone led them to a window that looked out toward the bunkhouse and other outbuildings. "There's a loft above the main bunkhouse that's not being used. With some work, it could make a fine schoolroom." Pearl could envision desks arranged in neat rows, a blackboard on one wall, shelves lined with books. Her teaching certificate was in her trunk, the one piece of her planned future that couldn't be taken away by deception. "I'd like to see it when the storm passes. And there's talk of building a proper schoolhouse in Bitterroot Falls come spring," Boone continued. "If you prove yourself here, you could have your pick of positions." The future suddenly seemed less bleak. Pearl had her education, her skills, her determination. She didn't need Thomas Whitmore or anyone else to make her way in the world. That evening, as the three of them sat by the fire in the main room, Josie played soft melodies on a fiddle that Boone had found in the Attichi's grandfather's, he said. The music seemed to chase away the storm's fury, creating a pocket of peace within the chaos outside. "This is nice," Josie said during a pause between songs. "It feels like home," Pearl finished. Boone nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I'd forgotten what that felt like. This house has been more museum than home for too long." "Why?" Pearl asked gently. "What happened to make you withdraw from the world?" Boone was quiet for so long that Pearl thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and careful. "I was engaged to be married 2 years ago. Caroline Brennan, the banker's daughter from Bitterroot Falls. We'd planned a spring wedding, had started making this house ready for a family." He picked up his journal from the side table, opening it to reveal pressed flowers between the pages. "These are from her garden. She loved flowers, said they brought life to any space. The week before our wedding, there was a fire at her father's house. She went back inside to save the family cat." His voice caught slightly. "The roof collapsed. She didn't make it out." Pearl felt tears prick her eyes. "I'm so sorry." "I blamed myself," Boone continued. "If I'd been faster, braver, less concerned with my own safety. You can't know that, Josie said firmly. Some things are beyond our control, no matter how much we wish otherwise. Boone looked at her with surprise, as if he hadn't expected such directness from someone so gentle in appearance. Perhaps, but guilt doesn't listen to logic. No, Pearl agreed. It doesn't, but life has to go on anyway. They sat in comfortable silence after that, each lost in their own thoughts. Pearl found herself studying Boone's profile in the firelight, noting the strength in his jaw, the intelligence in his eyes. He was a good man, she realized. Wounded, but good, and perhaps, in time, healable. As the evening wore on and they prepared to retire, Boone made an announcement that surprised them both. "I've been thinking about our arrangement," he said. "I want to make it official, legal. I'll draw up papers making you both employees of the Silver Spur ranch. Pearl as the official teacher, Josie as—" He paused, considering. "As the cultural instructor, music and refinement. It will give you legal standing, protect you from any future schemes by Blackwood or his associates." Pearl felt a wave of gratitude so strong it nearly overwhelmed her. "That's very generous." "It's practical," Boone corrected, "and it's right. You've both been wronged, but you don't have to be victims. Here, you can build something new, something better than what was taken from you." As Pearl lay in bed that night, listening to the storm rage outside, she realized that for the first time since leaving Chicago, she felt genuinely hopeful. Thomas Whitmore had been a fiction, but the life she was building here at the Silver Spur was real. And perhaps that was exactly what she needed, not a husband chosen by a stranger, but a future chosen by herself. The teaching certificate in her trunk had become more than just a piece of paper. It was her ticket to independence, to purpose, to a life of her own making. And if that life happened to include a wounded rancher with kind eyes and a gentle nature, well, that would be her choice too. Outside, the storm continued its assault on the Montana territory. But inside Calder House, 3 lost souls had found each other, and that seemed like its own kind of miracle. The storm raged for 3 more days before finally exhausting itself against the mountains. Pearl woke on the 4th morning to an almost startling silence, broken only by the gentle drip of melting snow from the eaves. Sunlight streamed through her bedroom window for the first time since her arrival, painting everything in shades of gold and promise. She dressed quickly and made her way downstairs, eager to see the world that had been hidden by the blizzard's fury. In the kitchen, she found Mrs. Kowalski humming as she prepared breakfast, a sure sign that the worst had passed. "Beautiful morning, isn't it?" the housekeeper said without turning around. "Mr. Boone's already out surveying the damage, and Miss Josie's in the music room practicing. Been at it since dawn, that one. Pretty as birdsong." Pearl poured herself coffee and stepped onto the back porch. The sight that greeted her took her breath away. Snow stretched in pristine white waves as far as the eye could see, broken only by the dark spears of pine trees and the weathered buildings of the ranch complex. The morning air was crisp and clean, so pure it seemed to cleanse her lungs with each breath. Movement caught her eye, and she spotted Boone riding toward the house on a magnificent chestnut horse. He sat easy in the saddle despite the deep snow, and she found herself admiring the confidence with which he managed both horse and terrain. When he saw her on the porch, he raised his hand in greeting and urged his mount toward her. "Good morning," he called out as he drew near. "Sleep well?" "Wonderfully. The silence woke me, in that peculiar—" Boone dismounted and tied his horse to the porch rail. Up close, Pearl could see that his cheeks were red from the cold and his eyes bright with the energy of a man who belonged outdoors. Not peculiar at all. Take some adjusting, going from city noise to country quiet. "How are you finding ranch life so far?" "Peaceful," Pearl admitted, "and purposeful. I'm eager to meet the children and see that loft you mentioned. Today's the perfect day for it. The snow's settled enough for safe walking, and the families are anxious to meet their new teacher." As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of Josie's fiddle drifted from the house, a lively tune that seemed to capture the morning's bright promise. Boone paused to listen, his expression softening. She's got real talent, Pearl observed. More than talent. There's something healing in her music. I haven't heard this house sound so alive since. He stopped, but Pearl understood. Since Caroline. They were interrupted by the approach of a Rydera grizzled man in his 50s, with the weathered face of someone who'd spent his life outdoors. He touched his hat, brim respectfully as he drew near. "Morning, boss." "Ma'am," he said, nodding to Pearl. "Thought you'd want to know we lost about 30 head in the north pasture. Fence came down just like you predicted, and they wandered into Bitter Creek Canyon. Boys are rounding them up now." Boone's jaw tightened. "Any injuries to the men?" "No, sir, just cold and tired. But we'll need to rebuild that whole section of fence before the next storm hits." "See to it, Jake, and tell the men there'll be hot coffee and Mrs. Kowalski's beef stew waiting when they're done." The man grinned. "That'll put some spring in their step, sure enough." He tipped his hat again and rode off. Pearl had watched this exchange with interest, noting the easy respect between the two men and Boone's immediate concern for his workers' welfare. "You care about your people," she observed. "They're what make this place work. I can plan and organize all I want, but without good men willing to do hard work in difficult conditions, the Silver Spur would fail inside a year. And their families, their children? That's where you come in. These men want their children to have opportunities they never had. Education opens doors that physical strength can't budge." Pearl felt a familiar stirring of excitement at the prospect of teaching again. "When can I meet them?" "This afternoon, if you're ready. But first, let me show you what you'll be working with." After breakfast, Boone led Pearl and Josie on a tour of the ranch complex. The snow made walking challenging, but Pearl was determined to see everything. The main barn was a massive structure that housed not only cattle, but also the ranch's prized horses. The blacksmith shop showed signs of recent use, with tools arranged neatly and a forge that radiated residual heat. But it was the bunkhouse that captured Pearl's attention. The main floor housed the unmarried ranch hands, but the loft above was spacious and well lit, with windows on both ends that would provide excellent natural light for reading and writing. "It's perfect," Pearl breathed, envisioning how she would arrange the space. "We'll need desks, a blackboard, books." "Already ordered," Boone said with a smile. "Should arrive with the next supply wagon from town. Jake's boys have been working on the desks in the evenings. Nothing fancy, but sturdy and functional." Pearl felt tears prick her eyes. In Chicago, she'd had to fight for every scrap of funding, every piece of equipment. Here, her needs were being anticipated and met without question. "Why?" she asked. "Why are you doing so much for someone you barely know?" Boone was quiet for a moment, looking out across the snow-covered range. "Because I know what it's like to have your future stolen by circumstances beyond your control. And because this ranch, these people, they deserve better than I've been giving them lately." That afternoon, Pearl met her first students. Word had spread through the ranch community that the new teacher was ready to begin, and 8 children ranging from 6 to 14 gathered in the bunkhouse loft with an eagerness that warmed her heart. There was Tommy Kowalski, Mrs. Kowalski's nephew, a bright 10-year-old with his aunt's practical nature. Sarah and Mary Chen, daughters of the ranch's cook, were twins who hung on Pearl's every word with identical expressions of concentration. Little Pete Morrison was only 6, but already showed the serious demeanor of a child who'd had to grow up quickly. The older children, Jim Baker, 14 and clearly the leader, his sister Lucy, 12, and the Hernandez siblings, Carlos and Maria, watched Pearl with the skeptical wariness of young people who'd been disappointed before. "I know some of you might think book learning isn't practical for ranch life," Pearl began, having dealt with similar attitudes before. "But let me tell you about numbers. Anyone here help with the cattle counts?" Several hands went up. "Then you know arithmetic is essential for ranch work. And reading. How else do you understand contracts, weather reports, breeding records? Writing helps you communicate with buyers, suppliers, banks." She saw interest replace skepticism in several faces. But we're not here just to learn practical skills. We're here to discover the world beyond this valley. Through books, you can travel to distant lands, meet fascinating people, explore ideas that might change how you see everything around you. By the end of that first session, Pearl knew she had them. Even Jim Baker, who'd started the afternoon with his arms crossed and his expression dubious, was asking questions about the books she planned to bring from the house library. As the children gathered their things to leave, Tommy Kowalski lingered behind. "Miss Fletcher," he said shyly, "my aunt says you and Miss Josie got swindled by a bad man. Says you're both real brave for starting over." Pearl felt her heart squeeze. "What do you think, Tommy?" The boy considered this seriously. "I think anybody who can make reading sound exciting probably isn't afraid of much." That evening, as they sat around the fire in the main room, Pearl shared the day's events with Boone and Josie. The fiddle lay across Josie's lap, and she'd been playing soft melodies while Pearl talked. "They're wonderful children," Pearl concluded. "Eager, intelligent, hungry for knowledge. I can't wait to really dig into lessons with them." "And they adore you already," Josie added. "I could hear their laughter from the house. This place hasn't heard that kind of joy in too long." Boone nodded, but Pearl noticed he seemed distracted. "Is something troubling you?" "Jake mentioned that strangers have been asking questions in town, about the ranch, about new arrivals. Could be nothing, but it could be Blackwood," Pearl finished, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. "We don't know that. Could be cattle buyers, land speculators, any number of legitimate interests, but I want you both to be careful when you're away from the house." Josie's music had stopped, and she was looking between them with worry. "You think he might come here?" "I think we should be prepared for anything," Boone said carefully. "This ranch is isolated enough that unwelcome visitors would have plenty of opportunity to cause trouble before help could arrive." Pearl straightened her shoulders. "Then we'll be ready for them. I didn't come this far to be intimidated by a confidence man." Boone's expression warmed with something like admiration. "I'm beginning to see why Blackwood's scheme failed. He underestimated the kind of women he was dealing with." "He certainly did," Josie agreed, her usual gentle demeanor showing a backbone of steel. "We may have been deceived, but we're not helpless." As they prepared for bed that night, Pearl reflected on how much her life had changed in just a few days. She'd gone from being a victim of fraud to being a valued member of a community, from having no future to having more possibilities than she'd ever imagined. And if those possibilities included a growing admiration for a certain rancher, with kind eyes and a generous heart, well, that was just another gift from the providence that had led her to this place. The teaching certificate in her trunk had become something more than professional credentials. It was her declaration of independence, her proof that she could build a life worth living on her own terms. And perhaps, in time, she might choose to share that life with someone who valued her for exactly who she was. Outside her window, the Montana night was crisp and clear, filled with stars that seemed close enough to touch. Tomorrow would bring new lessons, new challenges, new opportunities to build something meaningful from the ashes of her old dreams. She fell asleep with Josie's music echoing in her memory and the satisfaction of a day well spent warming her heart. 2 weeks into their new life at the Silver Spur, Pearl and Josie had fallen into a comfortable routine that felt surprisingly natural. Pearl spent her mornings teaching the ranch children, her afternoons working on lesson plans and grading papers, and her evenings in the main room with Boone and Josie, sharing stories and listening to music. It was during one of these evening sessions that Pearl noticed the quilt. Josie had been working on it in quiet moments, her needle flying through small, precise stitches. The pattern was beautiful, a double wedding ring design in blues and golds that seemed to capture both the Montana sky and the warmth of the house. "Where did you learn to quilt like that?" Pearl asked, settling beside Josie on the sofa. "My grandmother taught me. She said a woman should always have something beautiful growing under her hands, something that would outlast the hardships of daily life." Josie held up a completed section, examining it critically. "I started this on the train, thinking I'd have it finished for my new home. Now," she shrugged, Now I suppose it will mark a different kind of new beginning." Pearl touched the fabric gently. "It's lovely. The colors remind me of this place. That was intentional. I may not have gotten the life I planned, but I can still create something beautiful from what I have now." Across the room, Boone looked up from the ranch ledgers he'd been reviewing. "Is that what we're all doing here, creating something beautiful from what we have now?" The question hung in the air, weighted with meaning none of them were quite ready to name. Pearl felt heat rise in her cheeks as she met Boone's gaze. There had been moments lately, small ones, like when he'd helped her arrange the schoolroom, or when he'd listened with genuine interest to her stories about the children's progress when she'd sensed something shifting between them. "I think so," Josie said softly. "I think sometimes the most beautiful things come from the pieces that seemed broken beyond repair." That night, as Pearl lay in bed listening to the wind sing through the pines, she found herself thinking about Boone's question. What were they creating here? Was it just a temporary arrangement born of necessity, or something deeper? She'd been watching him these past weeks, noting the way he treated everyone with respect regardless of their station, the careful attention he paid to ranch operations, the quiet sadness that still shadowed his eyes when he thought no one was looking. He was a good man, she'd concluded. Better than good, he was the kind of man she'd always hoped to find, but had begun to believe didn't exist. The next morning brought unexpected visitors. Pearl was working with the younger children on their letters when shouts from the yard drew her attention. Through the loft window, she could see two riders approaching the main house official-looking men in dark coats who carried themselves with authority. She quickly dismissed the children and hurried toward the house, arriving just as Boone emerged from the barn. The visitors had dismounted and were waiting on the front porch, their expressions serious. "Mr. Calder?" The taller of the two men said. "I'm Sheriff Davidson from Bitterroot Falls, and this is Deputy Marshal Williams. We'd like to speak with you about some recent developments." Pearl felt her stomach drop. This had to be about Blackwood. "Of course," Boone replied calmly. "Come inside, Pearl. Would you find Josie and Mrs. Kowalski? I think they should hear this as well." They gathered in the main room, the officials looking somewhat out of place among the comfortable furniture and family atmosphere. Sheriff Davidson was a man in his 40s with prematurely grey hair and the weathered face of someone who'd spent his career dealing with frontier justice. The deputy marshal was younger, perhaps 30, with sharp eyes that seemed to take in every detail of the room. "Mr. Calder," the sheriff began, "we've had reports of unusual activity in the area, strangers asking questions, people making inquiries about your ranch and its recent guests." "What kind of inquiries?" Boone asked. Deputy Marshal Williams spoke up. "The kind that suggests someone's gathering information for purposes unknown. We've also received word from authorities in Chicago about a confidence man named Ezra Blackwood, who's been operating a matrimonial fraud scheme. 2 of his victims were supposedly traveling to this area when they disappeared." Pearl and Josie exchanged glances. "We're not missing," Pearl said carefully. "We're right here." "So we see," the sheriff replied, "which raises questions about what Blackwood's real plan might have been." Boone leaned forward. "What do you mean?" "Think about it," William said. "He goes to elaborate trouble to create false identities for fictional husbands, sends 2 educated women on the same stage to the same remote area, then disappears with their money. But he also had to know they'd eventually discover the deception. So what was the end game?" A chill ran down Pearl's spine as the implications became clear. "He wanted us stranded, alone, and vulnerable in unfamiliar territory." "That's our thinking," the sheriff confirmed. "Question is, why? What value would 2 stranded women have to a man like Blackwood?" The room fell silent as they all considered the disturbing possibilities. Finally, Boone spoke. "It doesn't matter what his plan was. Pearl and Josie are under my protection now, and they'll remain so for as long as they choose to stay." "That's admirable, Mr. Calder," William said. "But if Blackwood comes calling, you'll be dealing with more than just one man. He's known to work with associates roof men who don't hesitate to use violence when it serves their purposes." Then we'll be ready for them, Boone replied with quiet steel in his voice. After the officials left, promising to keep patrol in the area and send word of any developments, the household gathered around the kitchen table. Mrs. Kowalski bustled about making coffee, her movements sharp with agitation. "I don't like it," she declared. "Men like that, they don't give up easy. They see something they want, they take it." "But what could he want with us now?" Josie asked. "He already has our money." Pearl had been thinking about this, and a horrible possibility was taking shape in her mind. What if the money was never the real goal? What if it was just the means to get us here, isolated and dependent? "Dependent for what?" Boone asked, though his expression suggested he was reaching the same conclusions. Pearl took a shaky breath. "Think about it. Two educated, respectable women from good families, transported to a remote location under false pretenses. If we'd ended up where we were supposed to, stranded in some godless mining camp or frontier settlement, what options would we have had?" The implications hung heavy in the air. Mrs. Kowalski stopped stirring her coffee, her face pale. "Human trafficking," Boone said flatly. "That's what you're suggesting." "It would explain everything," Pearl continued, hating herself for voicing such thoughts but unable to ignore the logic. The elaborate deception, the forged documents, the care taken to choose women with no family nearby to search for them. Josie's hand flew to her throat. "Dear God, if you hadn't found us in that cave." "But I did find you," Boone said firmly. "And you're both safe here. Whatever Blackwood's plan was, it failed." "For now," Pearl said. "But if he invested this much time and effort, he's not likely to just write it off as a loss." That evening, as they sat in the main room, the atmosphere was notably subdued. Josie worked on her quilt with nervous energy, her stitches smaller and more precise than usual. Pearl tried to read, but found herself listening to every sound from outside. Boone cleaned his rifle with methodical care, the metallic clicks of the mechanism oddly comforting. "I keep thinking about timing," Pearl said suddenly. "The storm, your decision to ride fence lines that night, finding us in that cave. If any one thing had been different." "But they weren't different," Boone interrupted gently. "Some folks would call it luck, others might say providence. I'm not particular about the name, but I'm grateful for the outcome." "So am I," Josie said, not looking up from her needlework. "For the first time in months, I feel like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." Pearl studied her friend's serene expression. Despite everything they'd learned today, Josie seemed more at peace than fearful. "How can you be so calm about all this?" "Because I have something to fight for now," Josie replied simply. "Before, I was just a woman alone in the world, hoping some stranger would provide the security and family I craved. Now I have both, and I earned them myself. That makes them worth protecting." Pearl felt something shift inside her chest, a recognition of truth she'd been avoiding. Josie was right. Whatever they'd built here at the Silver Spur, it was theirs, by right of choice and effort, not circumstance or charity. "What are you thinking?" Boone asked, noting her expression. "That I'm tired of being afraid," Pearl said. "I came west looking for a new life, and I found one. It's not the life I planned, but it's the life I want. And I'm not going to let Ezra Blackwood or anyone else take it away from me." Boone's smile was warm with approval. "That's the spirit that's going to see us through this." "Us?" Pearl asked, her heart skipping slightly. "Of course us. You don't think I'm going to face whatever's coming alone, do you? We're a family now, even if it's not the conventional kind." Family. The word settled around Pearl's heart like a warm blanket. She looked at Josie, bent over her beautiful quilt, and at Boone, strong and steady in his chair, and realized that somewhere in the past few weeks, these people had become more precious to her than any fantasy she'd harbored about Thomas Whitmore. "Then we'll face it together," she said. "Whatever comes." Outside, the Montana night was crisp and clear, filled with stars that seemed to promise better days ahead. Inside Calder House, three people who'd found each other by accident were choosing to become family by design. And if that family had to be defended against those who would destroy it, well, They'd proven they were stronger together than any of them had been alone. As Pearl prepared for bed that night, she thought about the quilt. Josie was creating something beautiful made from individual pieces, each one strengthened by its connection to the whole. Perhaps that was what they were becoming, to a family quilt, patched together from broken dreams, but made stronger by the very act of mending. January settled over the Silver Spur like a heavy blanket, bringing with it the deepest cold Pearl had ever experienced. The windows of Calder House frosted over in intricate patterns that looked like fairy tale illustrations, and the morning ritual of breaking ice on the water troughs became as regular as sunrise. But inside the grand house, warmth prevailed in more ways than one. Pearl had been living at the ranch for nearly a month now, and the rhythm of days had become as natural as breathing. Her students were thriving under her instruction, progressing faster than she dared hope. Tommy Kowalski was reading at a level far beyond his years, while the Chen twins had developed a particular aptitude for mathematics that delighted their parents. Even Jim Baker, initially skeptical of book learning, had become fascinated by the geography lessons that showed him how vast the world truly was. But it was the evenings that Pearl treasured most. After supper, when the day's work was done and the three of them gathered in the main room, she felt a contentment she'd never known existed. Josie would play her fiddle, filling the space with melodies that seemed to capture the very essence of home, while Boone read aloud from books. Pearl selected Dickens, Austen, occasionally poetry that made them all fall silent with its beauty. Tonight was different, though. Boone seemed distracted, his attention wandering from the pages of Great Expectations to stare into the fire. Pearl had noticed his restlessness growing over the past few days, a tension in his shoulders that spoke of internal struggle. "Boone?" she said gently when he paused mid-sentence for the third time. "Is everything all right?" He closed the book and set it aside, then reached for the leather journal he kept always nearby. Pearl had grown curious about that journal, had noticed how he touched it in moments of deep thought or emotion. Tonight, instead of simply holding it, he opened it and removed something from between the pages. It was a ringer, delicate gold band set with a modest diamond that caught the firelight and threw tiny rainbows across the walls. "This was Caroline's," he said quietly, "her engagement ring. I've been carrying it for 2 years, unable to put it away but unable to look at it either." Josie's fiddle music softened to barely a whisper, creating a gentle backdrop for his words. "I thought I'd never be ready to let it go," Boone continued. "Thought that keeping it close somehow honored her memory, proved that I'd loved her truly." Pearl felt her heart begin to race, sensing that something significant was about to happen. "But I've come to realize that holding on to grief isn't the same as honoring love," Boone said, turning the ring in his fingers. "Caroline would have wanted me to live, to love again, to fill this house with the life and laughter she never got to bring to it." He looked up then, his eyes moving between Pearl and Josie, with an expression that made Pearl's breath catch. "I find myself in an unusual situation," he said with a slight smile. "When I built my life around the idea of loving one woman, I never imagined I might come to care deeply for 2. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Pearl felt heat rise in her cheeks, even as her mind raced to understand what he was saying. "Boone," Josie said softly, setting down her fiddle, "what are you telling us?" "I'm telling you that somewhere in the past month, you've both become essential to my happiness." "Pearl, your intelligence challenges me, your strength inspires me, your passion for teaching has brought new life to this ranch. And Josie, your gentleness has soothed hurts I thought would never heal. Your music has made this house feel like home again." Pearl's heart was beating so hard she was sure the others could hear it. "But surely you must care for one of us more than the other." Boone shook his head slowly. "That's what I kept telling myself I should feel. Society says a man chooses one woman, builds a life with her, and that's the natural order. But what I feel for you both is too real, too deep to be dismissed as confusion or temporary infatuation." He stood and moved to the fireplace, staring into the flames, as if seeking answers there. "I know it's not conventional. I know it would raise eyebrows in town, cause talk among the neighbors. But we're not exactly conventional people, are we? None of us ended up here through traditional means. Pearl looked at Josie, seeing her own confusion, and something else, something that might have been hope reflected in her friend's eyes. "What are you proposing?" Pearl asked, though she wasn't sure she was ready for the answer. Boone turned back to them, his expression earnest and vulnerable. "I'm not proposing anything yet. I'm simply being honest about my feelings and hoping you might be honest about yours. Because if I'm reading the signs correctly, I'm not the only one who's found unexpected affection in this arrangement." Pearl felt exposed, as if he'd looked directly into her heart and read all the feelings she'd been trying to keep hidden. She had grown to care for Boone more than care, if she was honest. But she'd also grown to love Josie like a sister, and the thought of competing with her for Boone's attention made her stomach clench with anxiety. "Pearl," Josie said suddenly, reaching for her hand, "what are you thinking?" Pearl looked down at their joined hands, then up at Josie's concerned face. "I'm thinking this is the most complicated situation I've ever found myself in. And I'm thinking that despite all the reasons it shouldn't work, I can't imagine being anywhere else or with anyone else." "Either of us?" Boone asked gently. Pearl felt tears prick her eyes. "Both of you. I love you both, just in different ways. Josie, you're the sister I never had, the friend I always needed. And Boone," she paused, gathering courage, "I think I fell in love with you the night you appeared in that cave like an answer to prayer." Josie squeezed her hand. "And I love you both as well, Pearl, for your strength and wisdom and the way you make me brave. Boone, for your kindness and the way you've given us both a home when we had nowhere else to turn." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of these confessions settling around them. Finally, Boone spoke. "Then perhaps we should stop trying to force our feelings into conventional molds and instead consider what kind of life would make us all happy." "What are you suggesting?" Pearl asked. "I'm suggesting that we take time to think about this. Really think about it. What we've built here is precious too. Precious to risk destroying by rushing into decisions we might regret." Josie picked up her fiddle again, running her fingers along the strings without making sound. "People would talk. People always talk," Boone replied. "The question is whether we're going to live our lives according to their expectations or our own happiness." Pearl felt a flutter of excitement mixed with fear. It would be unconventional. So was everything else that brought us together? Boone pointed out. The storm, the rescue, the deception that led us all here, perhaps unconventional, is exactly what we're meant to be. As they prepared to retire that evening, the atmosphere was charged with possibility and uncertainty in equal measure. Pearl lay in bed staring at the ceiling, her mind spinning with questions and scenarios. Was it possible for three people to build a life together? Could such an arrangement ever be more than a temporary accommodation? But even as doubts plagued her, she couldn't deny the rightness she felt when the three of them were together. In Josie, she'd found the deepest friendship of her life. In Boone, she'd discovered a man who valued her mind as much as her heart, who saw her as a partner rather than a dependent. And perhaps most importantly, she'd found herself. Not the woman who'd chased a stranger's promise of security, but the woman who could build her own future with her own hands. The ring Boone had shown them represented his past, his ability to love deeply and truly. That he was ready to put it away spoke of healing, of readiness for whatever came next. Outside her window, snow began to fall again, soft flakes that caught the moonlight like scattered diamonds. But Pearl felt no anxiety about being snowed in this time. Whatever the future held, she was exactly where she belonged, with the people who had become her family by choice rather than chance. In the morning, they would continue their careful dance around this new reality. But tonight, it was enough to know that love in all its unexpected forms had found them in the depths of a Montana winter and was keeping them warm against whatever storms might come. February brought the first hints of spring's distant promise. The brutal cold began to ease slightly, and on clear days, Pearl could see patches of bare ground appearing on the south-facing slopes where the snow had started its slow retreat. But with the changing season came a growing sense of urgency, as if they all understood that their winter sanctuary was temporary and decisions needed to be made. The conversation Boone had initiated about their unconventional feelings had been followed by several weeks of careful politeness, as if they were all afraid that speaking too openly might shatter the delicate balance they'd achieved. But the undercurrents were there, impossible to ignore the way Boone's hand lingered when he helped Pearl down from the wagon after a trip to town. The soft smiles Josie and Pearl shared when they thought no one was looking, the moments when all three found themselves in comfortable silence that spoke of deep understanding. It was Pearl who finally broke the careful detente. "We can't go on like this," she announced one evening as they sat in the main room. Josie was working on her quilt, which had grown considerably over the winter months, while Boone read through the latest batch of correspondence from town. Both looked up at her in surprise. "Like what?" Boone asked. "Like we're all walking on eggshells, afraid to say what we're really thinking or feeling. We've spent weeks dancing around the truth of this situation, and it's not helping anyone." Josie set down her needle. "What do you propose we do?" Pearl took a deep breath, gathering her courage. "I propose we have an honest conversation about what we want our future to look like. Because whether we acknowledge it or not, we're building something here. We have a choice. We can keep pretending this is temporary, or we can admit that we've become a family and decide what kind of family we want to be." Boone closed his letters and gave her his full attention. "You're right. I've been avoiding this conversation because I was afraid of pushing either of you into something you didn't want. And I've been avoiding it because I was afraid of what people would think," Josie admitted. "But I've realized something these past weeks. I care more about what you two think of me than what the rest of the world does." Pearl felt a rush of affection for this gentlewoman who'd shown such strength when it mattered. "Then let's be honest, Josie. How do you feel about Boone?" A blush colored Josie's cheeks, but she didn't look away. "I love him, not in the desperate way I thought I felt for Jonathan Mills, but in a deep, settled way that feels like coming home." "And you, Boone?" Pearl continued, her heart racing. "How do you feel about Josie?" "I love her," he said simply. "Her gentleness has helped heal wounds I thought would never stop aching. Her music has brought joy back into my life." Pearl nodded, then looked directly at Boone. "And me? You know how I feel about you, Pearl. Your strength amazes me. Your intelligence challenges me. Your passion inspires me. I love you fiercely." The words hung in the air between them, finally spoken aloud. Pearl felt tears prick her eyes, not from sadness, but from relief at finally hearing the truth they'd all been carrying. "Then what are we going to do about it?" she asked. Boone was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. When he spoke, his voice was thoughtful and careful. "There are places in this territory, remote places where people mind their own business and judge less harshly, where a man might live with two women who were both considered his wives in all but legal name. It's not common, but it's not unheard of either." Pearl's heart began to race. "You're talking about—" "I'm talking about the three of us making a life together, openly and honestly. No more pretending, no more temporary arrangements. A real family, built on love and choice." Josie's needle had stopped moving entirely. "But the law recognizes only one marriage." Boone acknowledged. "But there are ways around that. I could legally marry one of you and make provisions to ensure the other has the same rights and protections." Pearl felt dizzy with the implications. "You're serious about this?" "Dead serious. I've been thinking about it for weeks, trying to find a way to honor what I feel for both of you without forcing either of you to sacrifice your happiness for mine." "But which one would you marry legally?" Josie asked softly. Boone smiled. "I was hoping you two might figure that out between yourselves. From my perspective, you're both equally precious to me. The legal ceremony would be just paperwork. The real marriage would be between all three of us." Pearl looked at Josie, seeing her own wonder and fear reflected in her friend's eyes. "What do you think?" "I think it's the most unconventional proposal I've ever heard," Josie said with a shaky laugh. "And I think it might be perfect. But there would be challenges," Pearl felt compelled to point out. "Social ostracism, legal complications, questions about children." All solvable problems, Boone interrupted gently. Pearl, you've spent your whole life being practical and sensible. What does your heart tell you? Pearl closed her eyes, listening to the voice she'd spent years trying to silence in favor of logic and propriety. What it told her was that she'd never been happier than she was right here, right now, with these two people who'd become her world. My heart tells me that I don't care what anyone else thinks, she said, opening her eyes to meet their gazes. My heart tells me that home isn't a place, it's the people you choose to love. Josie reached for both their hands, creating a circle of connection around the coffee table. Then let's do it. Let's build something beautiful and unconventional and ours. The next morning brought unexpected validation of their decision in the form of Mrs. Kowalski, who appeared in the kitchen with her usual brisk efficiency but an unusual twinkle in her eye. About time you three stopped tiptoeing around each other, she announced as she started breakfast. Been obvious to anyone with eyes that you belong together. Pearl nearly choked on her coffee. You knew. Honey, I've been watching Mr. Boone pine away in this house for 2 years. Then you ladies arrive, and suddenly he's humming while he shaves and actually eating his meals instead of pushing food around his plate. Don't take a genius to figure out what's changed. And you don't disapprove? Josie asked tentatively. Mrs. Kowalski turned from the stove with a wooden spoon in her hand, her expression fierce with protective love. I've seen more misery caused by people doing what they're supposed to do instead of what makes them happy than I care to count. You three have found something special. Anyone who can't see that doesn't deserve an opinion. Her acceptance meant more to Pearl than she could express. Mrs. Kowalski had become like a mother to them all, and her blessing felt like the final piece falling into place. But their happiness was tempered later that day when Jake rode in with disturbing news. Boss, he said, pulling Boone aside after dismounting. We've got trouble. That fellow who's been asking questions in town, word is he's heading this way with some companions. Rough-looking men, according to the telegraph operator. Pearl felt her blood run cold. They all knew who the fellow had to be. When? Boone asked calmly, though Pearl could see the tension in his shoulders. Could be today, could be tomorrow. But soon. That evening, as they made preparations for potential trouble, Pearl found herself thinking about timing. Just when they'd finally found their path forward, Blackwood was coming to threaten everything they'd built. Are you afraid? Josie asked as they checked the locks on all the windows. Terrified, Pearl admitted, but also angry. We've done nothing wrong, built something beautiful and honest. I won't let him destroy it. Neither will I, Josie said firmly. This is our home, our family. We'll fight for it. Boone joined them in the main room, carrying his rifle and wearing the expression of a man prepared for war. Whatever happens, he said, we face it together, all of us. Pearl nodded, feeling the strength that came from being part of something larger than herself. They'd chosen each other freely, built love from the ashes of deception. That love was worth defending, worth fighting for. Outside, the Montana night was crisp and clear, filled with stars that seemed to promise better days ahead. Inside Calder House, 3 people who'd found an unconventional love were preparing to defend their right to live as they chose. The battle was coming, but they were ready. Together, they were stronger than any storm, natural or human, that might threaten their family. The riders came at dawn, emerging from the morning mist like dark harbingers of trouble. Pearl was in the kitchen, helping Mrs. Kowalski prepare breakfast, when the sound of hoofbeats on the frozen ground sent her to the window. What she saw made her blood turn to ice water. 5 men on horseback approached the house, led by a figure she recognized from her nightmare stall. Lean, with the kind of cruel handsomeness that had probably charmed many victims before destroying their lives. Ezra Blackwood rode like a man who owned the world, his companions flanking him with the casual menace of hired guns. Mrs. Kowalski, Pearl whispered, backing away from the window, get the children to the root cellar, now. The housekeeper took one look at Pearl's face and moved with swift efficiency, gathering the youngest ranch hands' children who often spent their mornings in the warm kitchen. Within moments, They disappeared through the cellar door, hidden from whatever was coming. Boone appeared in the kitchen doorway, fully dressed and armed, his face grim with determination. "I saw them coming. Where's Josie?" "Here," came the soft voice from behind him. Josie looked pale but resolute, carrying a small derringer that seemed almost delicate in her hands. "I may be a preacher's daughter, but Papa made sure I knew how to protect myself." The sound of boots on the front porch announced their visitor's arrival. A heavy knock echoed through the house, the polite rap of welcome guests, but the demanding pound of men used to having doors opened quickly. "Mr. Calder," Blackwood's voice carried through the heavy oak door, smooth as silk and twice as dangerous. "I believe you have something that belongs to me." Boone moved to the front door but didn't open it. "You're trespassing, Blackwood. State your business and get off my land." "My business is simple," came the reply. "I've come to collect my property. 2 women who entered into legal contracts with my organization. Contracts that make them my responsibility until they're properly delivered to their intended destinations." Pearl felt sick at the casual way he spoke of them as property, but she also recognized the calculated nature of his words. He was trying to establish some kind of legal justification for whatever he planned to do. "The women you're referring to are guests in my home," Boone called back. "They're free to come and go as they please, and they've chosen to stay." "I'm afraid that's not how the law sees it," Blackwood replied, and Pearl could hear the false regret in his voice. "These ladies signed binding agreements. They're fugitives from their legal obligations." "What legal obligations?" Pearl stepped forward, her anger overcoming her fear. "To marry men who don't exist, to honor contracts based on fraud and deception." She heard Blackwood's low chuckle through the door. "Miss Fletcher, how delightful to hear your voice again. I trust you've been comfortable during your extended vacation. And Miss Lane, I do hope you're well. You've both caused me considerable trouble by disappearing the way you did." "We didn't disappear," Josie called out, her voice steadier than Pearl had expected. "We were stranded in a blizzard and rescued by Mr. Calder." "Ah, yes, the heroic rescue. How convenient." Blackwood's tone turned harder. "But I'm afraid your adventure ends here. I have documentation proving that both ladies are bound by legal contract to complete their journeys to their intended husbands. Sheriff Mason here has reviewed the papers and agrees." Pearl's heart sank as she recognized the voice that spoke next told her, gravelly, with the authority of law behind it. "Mr. Calder, this is Sheriff Mason. I've got court orders here requiring the release of these women to Mr. Blackwood's custody. You're interfering with legal proceedings." Boone's jaw tightened. "May I see these court orders?" "Of course," Blackwood said smoothly, "though I should mention that I've brought associates to ensure there's no misunderstanding about the legal requirements here." Through the window, Pearl could see 2 more riders emerging from the tree's hard-faced men, with guns prominently displayed. Her stomach lurched as she realized the scope of Blackwood's operation. This wasn't just fraud, it was something much worse. Boone opened the door cautiously, keeping his rifle ready. The man who called himself Sheriff Mason was stocky and grey-haired, wearing a badge that gleamed in the morning sun. But something about his eyes made Pearl deeply uneasy. "These are the court orders," Mason said, handing Boone a sheaf of official-looking papers. "Signed by Judge Morrison in Helena. The ladies are to be remanded to Mr. Blackwood's custody immediately." Pearl watched Boone's face as he read the documents, noting how his expression grew increasingly troubled. Finally, he looked up. "These papers look authentic," he admitted reluctantly. "But they're based on fraudulent contracts. The men these women were supposed to marry don't exist." "That's neither here nor there," Blackwood interjected. "The contracts are real. The commitments are binding. These ladies have obligations to fulfill." "What obligations?" Pearl demanded, stepping closer to the door. "To be sold to the highest bidder, to disappear into whatever hellish fate you had planned for us." Blackwood's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something cold and predatory underneath. "Such dramatic language, Miss Fletcher. You're going to your new homes, just as promised. Though I admit the destinations may have changed somewhat due to your extended absence." "What does that mean?" Josie asked, though Pearl suspected they both knew. "It means," Blackwood said with cruel satisfaction, "that your original purchaser, intended husband shave grown tired of waiting. Fortunately, I've found alternative arrangements. There are mining camps in the territories that pay very well for refined companionship." The horrifying truth hit Pearl like a physical blow. They hadn't been intended for marriage at all, but for something far worse. The elaborate deception, the careful selection of educated women from good families, the isolation, it all made terrible sense now. "You're talking about slavery," Boone said, his voice deadly quiet. "I'm talking about legal contracts," Blackwood corrected. "These women owe substantial debts for their transportation, lodging, and matrimonial services. They'll work off those debts in whatever capacity their new employers require." "Over my dead body," Boone said flatly. "That can be arranged." One of Blackwood's men spoke for the first time, his hand moving to his gun. The sheriff, if he really was a sheriff, held up a warning hand. "Now, let's keep this civil. Mr. Calder, you seem like a reasonable man. These legal documents require me to take these women into custody. You can make this easy, or you can make it hard. But either way, they're coming with us." Pearl felt the walls closing in around them. The papers looked official, the badge looked real, and they were outnumbered and outgunned. But then she remembered something that made her straighten with renewed hope. "Sheriff Mason," she said sweetly, stepping fully into the doorway, "before you take us anywhere, I'd like you to explain something. How exactly does a sheriff from Helena have jurisdiction in Gallatin County?" The man's eyes flickered with something that might have been uncertainty. "And another thing," Pearl continued, her teacher's instincts for research serving her well. "Judge Morrison has been dead for 3 years. I remember reading about it in the Chicago papers because he was famous for his work on territorial law." The silence that followed was deafening. Blackwood's carefully constructed facade was crumbling, and Pearl could see the desperation beginning to show in his eyes. "You always were too clever for your own good," he snarled, dropping all pretense of civility. "No matter, official or not, you're coming with us. Boys." The situation exploded into violence as Blackwood's men went for their guns. Boone threw himself sideways, using the doorframe for cover as he brought his rifle up. The fake sheriff fumbled for his weapon, clearly not expecting resistance. Pearl grabbed Josie's hand and pulled her back into the house as gunfire erupted on the front porch. The sharp crack of rifles and the heavier boom of shotguns filled the air, along with shouted curses and the whinnying of frightened horses. "The back door," Josie gasped, but Pearl shook her head. "No, we stay and fight. This is our home." Through the chaos, Pearl could hear other sounds, the thunder of approaching hoofbeats and voices she recognized. Jake and the ranch hands were coming, drawn by the gunfire. Help was on the way. The battle was brief, but vicious. When the smoke cleared, 2 of Blackwood's men lay wounded in the yard. Another had fled on horseback, and the fake sheriff sat against the porch railing, clutching a bloody shoulder. Only Blackwood himself had escaped unharmed, though his carefully laid plans were in ruins. "This isn't over," he snarled, as Jake and 3 other ranch hands surrounded him with their weapons drawn. "I've invested too much in this operation to walk away now." "Yes, it is," Boone said calmly, though Pearl could see the fury burning in his eyes. "Because now we know what you really are, and so will every lawman and judge in the territory." Blackwood's smile was cruel and confident. "You have no idea what you're dealing with, Calder. This goes far beyond your little ranch and your rescued damsels. I have partners, investors, clients who expect their merchandise delivered." "Merchandise?" Pearl stepped forward, her own anger finally unleashed. "Is that what you call human beings? Merchandise? I call them what they area sets to be acquired, managed, and sold for profit. It's simple business, Miss Fletcher. Supply and demand." The casual way he spoke of slavery and human trafficking made Pearl's stomach turn, but it also crystallized her resolve. This man represented everything evil about the frontier: the exploitation of the vulnerable, the corruption of law and order, the reduction of human dignity to mere profit. "Take him to town," Boone ordered Jake. "All of them. Let the real authorities sort this out. As they watched Blackwood and his surviving associates being led away under guard, Pearl felt a mixture of relief and lingering fear. The immediate threat was over, but Blackwood's words about partners and investors suggested something larger and more dangerous than a simple confidence scheme. "We won," Josie said softly, but her voice held the same uncertainty Pearl felt. "This battle," Boone agreed, "but I suspect the war is just beginning." Pearl nodded, looking around at the ranch that had become her home, at the people who had become her family. Whatever came next, they would face it together. They'd proven today that their love was strong enough to fight for, their family worth defending. But as she watched the riders disappear into the distance, carrying Blackwood toward whatever justice awaited him, Pearl couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of their troubles. Men like Blackwood didn't work alone, and operations of this scope had deep roots that wouldn't be easily pulled up. Still, they were alive, they were together, and they were free. For now, that was enough. 3 days after Blackwood's capture, word came from Bitterroot Falls that shattered any illusions they might have harbored about their troubles being over. Jake rode in at sunset, his face grim with news that made Pearl's blood run cold. "He's gone," Jake announced without preamble as they gathered in the main room. Blackwood and his men escaped during transport to Helena. Boone set down his coffee cup with careful control. "How?" "Armed men intercepted the wagon about 10 miles outside town. Killed Deputy Harrison, wounded Marshal Thompson bad enough that he might not make it. Professional job, they knew exactly when and where to strike." Pearl felt the familiar chill of fear settle over her. "His partners." "Has to be," Jake agreed. "But there's more. Before they broke him out, Blackwood was talking. Bragging, really, about how this was just the beginning. Said he had business interests all over the territory, and losing a few women wasn't going to shut him down." Josie's hands stilled on her ever-present quilting. "What kind of business interests?" Jake looked uncomfortable. "Mining camps, lumber operations, railroad construction sites, places where men have money but no women. He's been supplying them with what they want." The implications hit Pearl like a physical blow. Blackwood wasn't just a confidence man working alone. He was running a sophisticated operation that trafficked women across the entire Montana territory. And they'd made themselves targets by exposing his methods. "There's something else," Jake continued reluctantly. "Marshal Thompson, before he passed out from blood loss, he managed to tell Sheriff Davidson what Blackwood said about the Silver Spur. Claims he's got a legal right to this ranch, says Boone's father owed him money that was never repaid." Boone's expression darkened. "That's impossible. My father was meticulous about his debts. He never owed anyone anything." "Maybe not," Jake said. "But Blackwood's got papers that say different. Forged, most likely, but they look official enough to cause trouble. He's claiming the ranch as collateral for unpaid loans." Pearl felt the walls closing in around them again. Even in custody, Blackwood had been setting his next trap. Now, free and angry, he would be coming for them with everything he had. "How long do we have?" Boone asked. "Hard to say. Could be days, could be weeks. But Sheriff Davidson thinks Blackwood will try to use the legal system, first file claims, get court orders, make it look legitimate before he resorts to violence again." "Then we need to be ready for both," Pearl said, her mind already working through possibilities. Legal defense and physical defense. That night, as they planned their strategy, Pearl found herself studying the faces of the two people who'd become her world. Boone's jaw was set with determination, but she could see the worry in his eyes. This ranch was his heritage, his legacy, everything his family had built over 3 generations. The thought of losing it to Blackwood's schemes had to be tearing him apart. Josie appeared calm on the surface, her fingers working steadily on her quilt, but Pearl noticed the tension in her shoulders, the way her needle moved with more force than necessary. They were all afraid, but they were also united in their determination to fight. "I've been thinking," Pearl said during a... Dawn was still an hour away when they came, moving through the pre-dawn darkness like shadows given deadly purpose. Pearl was awake, had been awake most of the night, listening to every sound from outside when she heard the first soft footstep on the front porch. She slipped from her bed and padded barefoot to Boone's room, finding him already awake and reaching for his rifle. "They're here," she whispered. "I know. Get Josie and Mrs. Kowalski. Stay away from the windows." Pearl's heart was racing as she woke the others, her hands shaking as she helped Mrs. Kowalski gather the few household staff into the kitchen pantry where they'd be safest. Josie appeared in a wrapper, her hair braided and her small derringer in her hand. "How many?" Josie asked. "Too many," Boone replied grimly, peering through a crack in the front curtains. "At least a dozen, maybe more. They've got the house surrounded." Pearl joined him at the window, careful to stay out of sight. In the grey pre-dawn light, she could see dark figures positioned around the ranch buildings, some near the barn, others by the bunkhouse, several more spread across the yard. They moved with military precision, clearly experienced in this kind of work. "Mr. Calder," Blackwood's voice carried across the yard, amplified by the crisp morning air. "I believe we had an appointment to discuss terms." Boone didn't answer immediately, instead checking his rifle and the extra ammunition he'd laid out the night before. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm and carrying. "The only terms I'm interested in are your unconditional surrender and departure from my land." Blackwood's laughter was cold and mocking. "I'm afraid that's not going to happen. You see, I've brought some new documentation that I think you'll find very interesting. Legal papers that prove your ownership of this ranch is questionable." A figure stepped into view near the front gatire, thin man in a black coat carrying what appeared to be official documents. Even from a distance, Pearl could see the gleam of a badge on his chest. "This is Territorial Judge Hartley," Blackwood called out. "He's here to serve you with a court order requiring you to vacate these premises immediately. It seems there were some irregularities in your father's original land purchase that have only recently come to light." Pearl felt sick. Even if the judge was legitimate, which she doubted, the documents he carried would certainly be forgeries. But out here, far from civilization, Blackwood's version of the law might be the only law that mattered. "I don't recognize the authority of a judge who travels with an army of gunmen," Boone called back. "Judge Hartley is here for his own protection," Blackwood replied smoothly. "These are dangerous times, and the territorial government takes the safety of its officials very seriously. Now, are you going to comply with this legal order, or do we need to discuss the consequences of resisting lawful authority?" Boone looked at Pearl and Josie, his expression grim. "He's got us in a corner. If we resist, he can claim we're defying legal authority. If we comply, we lose everything." "Then we make him prove his authority," Pearl said, an idea forming in her mind. "Josie, where's that quilt you finished?" "In the main room, but I don't see." "Trust me," Pearl interrupted. "We're going to need it." She moved quickly to retrieve the beautiful blue and gold quilt, its double wedding ring pattern gleaming even in the dim light. It was heavy in her arms, substantial and real, in a way that felt important. "What are you planning?" Boone asked. "Something unconventional," Pearl replied. "But first, we need to buy some time. Tell Blackwood you want to see those court documents before you comply with anything." Boone nodded and called out the window. "I want to examine those documents before I accept their validity. Send your judge up to the porch alone." There was a long pause, followed by what sounded like heated discussion among Blackwood's group. Finally, the thin man in the black coat began walking toward the house, his hands carefully visible and empty, except for the papers he carried. "That's far enough," Boone called when the man reached the bottom of the porch steps. "Hold up those documents so I can see them." Judge Hartley, if that's who he really was, raised the papers obligingly. Even from the window, Pearl could see they looked official, complete with seals and ribbons. "These orders require your immediate evacuation of these premises," Hartley called out in a reedy voice. "You have 1 hour to gather your personal belongings and depart." "And where exactly am I supposed to go?" Boone asked. "That's not the court's concern. The property reverts to its rightful owner, Mr. Blackwood, who holds valid liens against the ranch dating back to your father's time." Pearl had heard enough. She moved to the front door, the quilt bundled in her arms. "Pearl, what are you doing?" Josie whispered urgently. "Something that should have been done weeks ago." Pearl replied, then raised her voice to carry to the yard. "Judge Hartley, before you proceed with this order, there's something you should know." She opened the door and stepped onto the porch, Boone immediately moving to shield her with his body. The morning air was sharp with cold and tension. "Mr. Blackwood's claims against this ranch are based on forged documents," Pearl announced clearly. "We have proof that the papers he's shown you are fraudulent." "That's a serious accusation, miss," Hartley replied, though something in his voice suggested he wasn't entirely surprised. "It's easily proven," Pearl continued. "The papers Blackwood claims were signed by Judge Morrison were dated after the judge's death. We have complete records of Morrison's cases, and there's no mention of any dealings with the Calder family." She could see Blackwood's face from where she stood, and the flash of anger that crossed his features told her she'd hit the mark, but his recovery was quick. "Judge Hartley," Blackwood called out, "I believe we're dealing with desperate people making desperate claims. Perhaps it's time to end this discussion and proceed with the lawful order." "Perhaps," Hartley agreed, though he sounded less certain than before. "Miss, do you have this alleged proof with you?" "I do," Pearl said, then did something that surprised everyone, including herself. She held up the quilt, letting it unfold to its full size. "But first, I want to make something clear to everyone here." The quilt caught the morning light, its blue and gold pattern seeming to glow against the dark wood of the porch. It was beautiful and domestic, and utterly incongruous in the midst of their armed standoff. "This quilt was made by Miss Josie Lane during the winter months we've spent at the Silver Spur ranch," Pearl announced, her voice carrying clearly across the yard. "Every stitch was sewn with love, every pattern piece chosen with care. It represents the home we've built here, the family we've become." She could see confusion on the faces of Blackwood's men, but she pressed on. "Mr. Blackwood, you see women as merchandise to be bought and sold. You see this ranch as property to be seized through fraud and violence. But you don't understand what you're really trying to destroy." "Miss Fletcher," Blackwood called out, his patience clearly wearing thin, "your domestic arrangements are of no interest to me. Business is business." "Exactly my point," Pearl replied. "You think this is just business, but it's not. It's love, freely given and freely received. It's family, chosen rather than forced. It's home, built by choice rather than circumstance." She turned to face Judge Hartley directly. "Sir, before you proceed with enforcing whatever papers Mr. Blackwood has shown you, I ask you to consider this. Are you here to serve justice or to enable the destruction of innocent lives?" Hartley was quiet for a long moment, studying her face. When he finally spoke, his voice held a note of uncertainty. "Miss, these are legal proceedings. Personal feelings are exactly what the law is supposed to protect." Pearl interrupted. "The right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The right to build a family according to one's own conscience. The right to be free from fraud and coercion." She held up a bundle of papers she'd brought from inside. "These are copies of the real territorial records regarding this ranch. They prove that Boone Calder's ownership is legitimate and that his father never had any dealings with Ezra Blackwood." "Judge Hartley," Blackwood's voice was sharp with command. "Enough of this theatrical nonsense. Execute the court order, or I'll report your failure to comply with territorial authority." Pearl saw something change in Hartley's expression at the threatening tone. Whatever hold Blackwood had over the judge, it was based on fear rather than legitimate authority. "Furthermore," Pearl continued quickly, "Mr. Blackwood is wanted by federal authorities for human trafficking. The women he claims to represent weren't intended for marriage, but for slavery in mining camps and lumber operations throughout the territory." The accusation hit Blackwood's men like a physical blow. Pearl could see several of them exchanging glances, clearly uncomfortable with the implications of what they'd been hired to do. "That's slander," Blackwood snarled. "Judge Hartley, I demand you proceed immediately with the eviction order." But something had shifted in the dynamics of the standoff. Hartley was no longer looking at his papers but studying Blackwood with new wariness. Several of the hired guns were backing away, apparently having second thoughts about their involvement. "Actually," Hartley said slowly, "I think I'd like to examine Miss Fletcher's evidence before proceeding further." "There's no time for that," Blackwood snapped. "The order is clear." "The order is whatever I say it is," Hartley interrupted with sudden authority. "And I'm saying I want to see these territorial records before I make any final determinations." Pearl felt a surge of hope. Whatever game Blackwood was playing, it was starting to unravel. But she also knew that desperate men were dangerous men, and Blackwood was nothing if not desperate. As if reading her thoughts, Blackwood's hand moved toward his gun. "I'm afraid that's not acceptable, Judge. You have your orders." The morning erupted into chaos as Blackwood drew his weapon, not pointing it at Boone or Pearl, but at Judge Hartley himself. The pretense of legal authority was finally stripped away, revealing the brutal reality underneath. "You see, Judge," Blackwood said with cold satisfaction, "you're going to sign that eviction order, and you're going to do it now, because if you don't, you won't be leaving this ranch alive." The moment Blackwood's gun swung toward Judge Hartley, everything changed. The thin pretense of legality evaporated, leaving only naked violence and desperation. Pearl clutched the quilt tighter, its weight suddenly feeling like armor against the chaos erupting around them. "Nobody has to die here," Boone called out, his rifle trained on Blackwood, but his voice steady and calm. "You're outnumbered, Blackwood. Look around you, half your men are already backing away." It was true. Pearl could see several of Blackwood's hired guns retreating toward their horses, clearly having no stomach for threatening a territorial judge. Whatever they'd been paid, it wasn't enough to risk hanging for kidnapping and murder. But Blackwood wasn't looking at his departing men. His attention was fixed on Judge Hartley, who stood frozen with the gun pointed at his chest. "Sign the order," Blackwood commanded. "Now." "I can't," Hartley stammered. "Not like this. This is kidnapping, threatening a federal official." "This is business," Blackwood cut him off. "The same business you've been part of for months, taking payments to look the other way, while I moved merchandise through your territory." Pearl felt sick as the full scope of the corruption became clear. Hartley wasn't just a bribed judge, he was a full partner in Blackwood's trafficking operation. "That's different," Hartley protested. "Those were just..." "Just what?" Josie's voice came from the doorway behind Pearl, clear and cutting. "Just women who didn't matter, just lives you thought were worth nothing." Pearl turned to see her friend standing in the doorway, no longer hiding but facing their attackers with quiet dignity. Her small derringer was steady in her hands, pointed not at Blackwood, but at Judge Hartley. "Miss Lane," Blackwood said with cruel satisfaction, "how convenient. Now I can collect both my missing merchandise at once." "We're not merchandise," Pearl said firmly, stepping closer to Josie. "We're human beings with rights and dignity and the power to choose our own destinies." She held up the quilt again, letting it catch the morning light. "This quilt represents everything you'll never understand, Mr. Blackwood. It's made of individual pieces, each one beautiful on its own, but stronger when joined with others. That's what family is, what love is, what you're trying to destroy." "Enough poetry," Blackwood snarled. "Judge, sign that order, or I'll shoot you and claim you were killed, resisting my men's attempts to serve legal papers." But as he spoke, Pearl noticed movement in the distance riders, approaching from the direction of town. A lot of riders, moving fast and purposefully. Her heart leaped with hope, even as she tried not to let her relief show on her face. Boone had noticed, too. "Expecting company, Blackwood?" Blackwood's head snapped around to follow their gaze, and Pearl saw his confidence falter as he took in the approaching horsemen. There were at least 20 of them, and even from a distance, the glint of badges was visible. "Federal marshals," Judge Hartley said with obvious relief. "I sent word yesterday about irregularities in these proceedings." Blackwood's face went white with rage. "You betrayed me." "I saved myself," Hartley corrected. "When you started talking about taking territorial judges hostage, you crossed a line even I wouldn't cross." The sound of hoofbeats grew louder as the federal marshals closed the distance. Pearl could see that they were heavily armed and moving with the precision of men who expected trouble. "It's over, Blackwood," Boone called out. "Surrender now, and maybe you'll live to see trial." But desperation made men dangerous, and Blackwood was nothing if not desperate. Instead of surrendering, he grabbed Judge Hartley by the arm and pressed his gun to the man's head. "Nobody moves," he shouted. "I still have a hostage, and I still have men positioned around this ranch. Try to take me, and people die." Pearl looked around the yard and realized he was right. While several of his hired guns had fled, others remained at their positions, their weapons trained on the house. The federal marshals were still several hundred yards away too far to help immediately. "What do you want?" Boone asked. "I want safe passage out of here," Blackwood replied. "Me and my remaining men, horses and supplies, and a 2-hour head start before anyone follows." "And in exchange?" "I don't kill the judge, and I don't burn down your precious ranch with everyone inside it." Pearl felt the quilt in her hands and suddenly knew what she had to do. It was dangerous, possibly suicidal, but it was also the only way to end this without more bloodshed. "I have a better offer," she called out, stepping forward before anyone could stop her. "Pearl, no," Boone warned, but she was already moving. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, walking slowly down the porch steps with the quilt still in her arms. "You wanted us as merchandise. Here's your chance to collect." "What are you doing?" Josie hissed behind her. "What I should have done months ago," Pearl replied, not taking her eyes off Blackwood, fighting back. She was halfway across the yard now, close enough to see the desperation in Blackwood's eyes, the way his hand shook slightly as he held the gun to Hartley's head. "You let Judge Hartley go," she continued, "and I'll come with you voluntarily. No fight, no resistance. One valuable piece of merchandise in exchange for your freedom." "Pearl, don't!" Boone shouted, but she held up her hand to stop him. "It's my choice," she called back. "My life, my decision." Blackwood was studying her with predatory interest. "And what about your friend? Miss Lane comes too, or there's no deal?" "No," Pearl said firmly. "Just me. That's the offer." For a moment, the entire yard was silent, except for the approaching thunder of the federal marshal's horses. Blackwood was clearly weighing his options, calculating odds and risks. "You think you're being noble," he said finally, "but you're just delaying the inevitable. I'll take you now, and I'll come back for her later." "Maybe," Pearl agreed. "But maybe not. Maybe those federal marshals will catch you before you get 10 miles from here. Maybe your remaining men will decide saving their own necks is more important than following a madman." She took another step closer, close enough now that Blackwood could have reached out and grabbed her. "Or maybe," she continued, "you'll discover that some merchandise fights back." With that, she threw the quilt directly at Blackwood's face, the heavy fabric momentarily blinding him and causing him to stagger backward. In that instant of confusion, Judge Hartley broke free and dove for cover behind a water trough. Blackwood roared with rage and swung his gun toward Pearl, but Boone's rifle cracked like thunder, the bullet taking Blackwood in the shoulder and spinning him around. Josie's derringer barked twice, and one of Blackwood's men cried out and fell. The yard erupted into gunfire as the remaining hired guns opened up on the house. Pearl dove behind the same water trough as Judge Hartley, splinters flying from the wooden buildings around them as bullets filled the air. But the federal marshals had arrived, surrounding the ranch and adding their firepower to the battle. The fight was brief but vicious, ending only when the last of Blackwood's men threw down their weapons and surrendered. When the smoke cleared, Blackwood lay wounded but alive in the dirt of the ranch yard, cursing and bleeding from his shoulder. His grand scheme had finally collapsed, brought down by the very women he'd tried to reduce to mere property. Pearl retrieved her quilt from where it had fallen, noting with satisfaction that while it was dirty and torn, it was still intact. Like their family, it had survived the violence and emerged battered but unbroken. "That was the bravest, most foolish thing I've ever seen," Boone said as he pulled her into his arms, his voice shaking with reaction. "That was the most beautiful thing I've ever seen," Josie corrected, joining their embrace. You turned that quilt into a weapon of love. As the federal marshals led Blackwood and his surviving men away in chains, Pearl looked around at the ranch that had become her home. There would be questions to answer, legal proceedings to endure, repairs to make, but they were free, they were together, and they were safe. The sun was fully up now, painting the Montana landscape in shades of gold and promise. In the distance, the mountains stood eternal and unchanging, witnesses to the triumph of love over greed, family over exploitation, choice over coercion. Pearl clutched her damaged but beautiful quilt and smiled. They had won more than just a battle they had won, the right to love as they chose, to build the family they wanted, to live free from the predators who would reduce human dignity to mere profit. It was, she thought, exactly the kind of victory worth fighting for. 6 months later, Pearl stood on the same porch where she'd faced down Ezra Blackwood, but everything about the scene had changed. Where violence and desperation had once reigned, peace and prosperity now flourished. The ranch yard bustled with the organized chaos of spring roundup, the sound of cattle lowing mixing with the laughter of children and the calls of working men. The schoolhouse Boone had built for her sat gleaming white in the morning sun, its bell tower reaching toward the endless Montana sky. 23 students now attended classes there, children from the Silver Spur and neighboring ranches, their eager faces a testament to the power of education to transform lives. Pearl's teaching certificate, once just a piece of paper representing distant dreams, had become the foundation of something larger, a real school that would serve the valley for generations to come. But it was the sound of music that made her smile most broadly. From the open windows of Calder House came the sweet strains of Josie's fiddle, playing a waltz that seemed to capture all the joy and contentment of their new life. The house that had once echoed with loneliness now rang with laughter and love, exactly as Boone's father had envisioned when he built it for entertaining and family gatherings. "Admiring your kingdom," Boone's voice came from behind her, warm with affection and gentle teasing. Pearl turned to find him watching her with the expression that never failed to make her heart flutter equal, parts love and admiration, seasoned with the deep contentment of a man who had found his place in the world. He looked healthier than he had that first winter, the shadows of grief replaced by lines of laughter around his eyes. "Our kingdom," she corrected, moving into the circle of his arms. "Though I was thinking it looks more like paradise than a kingdom." "Paradise with cattle," Boone agreed, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "And spring carving, and fence repair, and all the other practical realities of ranch life." "I wouldn't have it any other way," Pearl said, meaning every word. The life they'd built together was far from the genteel existence she'd once imagined for herself, but it was infinitely more satisfying. Every challenge overcome, every problem solved, every success achieved felt more meaningful because it belonged to all of them. The sound of approaching hoofbeats drew their attention to the road, where a familiar wagon was raising dust in the distance. Pearl recognized the driver, immediately Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the new physician who'd established practice in Bitterroot Falls and had become one of their closest friends. "Perfect timing," Boone murmured. "Josie will be pleased." Dr. Mitchell had been instrumental in the final legal proceedings against Blackwood and his network of co-conspirators. Her testimony about the physical and psychological damage inflicted on trafficking victims had helped secure convictions that sent Blackwood to federal prison for the rest of his natural life. But more than that, she'd helped them understand and process their own experiences, providing guidance that had strengthened their unusual family bonds. The wagon pulled up to the house just as Josie emerged from the front door, her face lighting up with genuine pleasure at seeing their friend. The three women had formed a strong friendship over the months, united by their shared commitment to protecting and empowering other women in similar circumstances. "Sarah!" Josie called out, hurrying down the porch steps. "How did the meeting in Helena go?" Dr. Mitchell's smile was radiant as she accepted Josie's embrace. "Better than we dared hope." The territorial legislature has approved funding for the new women's shelter, and they want us to serve as the organizing committee. Pearl felt tears of joy prick her eyes. For months, they'd been working to establish a refuge for women escaping situations like the one Blackwood had tried to force on them. The idea had grown from their own experience into something much larger, a network of safe houses and support services that could help trafficking victims rebuild their lives. "That's wonderful news," Pearl said, joining the embrace. "When do we start?" "Immediately, if you're willing. The first location will be here in Bitterroot Falls, but they want to establish satellite facilities throughout the territory. We'll need teachers, counselors, advocates, people who understand what these women have endured." Pearl exchanged glances with Boone and Josie, seeing her own excitement reflected in their faces. They'd talked about this possibility many times, dreaming of ways to turn their personal victory into something that could help others. "Count us in," Boone said without hesitation. "Whatever resources you need, whatever support we can provide." That evening, as they gathered in the main room that had witnessed so many important conversations, Pearl found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this moment. The leather-bound journal that had once held pressed flowers from Caroline's garden now contained detailed plans for the women's shelter. Boone's healing symbolized by his transformation of grief into constructive action. Josie's quilt, repaired and more beautiful than ever, hung prominently on the wall, its blue and gold pattern catching the firelight. It had become a symbol of their family's resilience, proof that beautiful things could emerge from broken pieces when bound together with love and determination. "I have something to show you both," Boone said, producing a small wooden box from his desk drawer. Inside, nestled in velvet, were 2 rings, not Caroline's engagement ring, which had been respectfully buried with her memory, but new rings, designed specifically for their unique situation. "I had these made in Helena," he explained, his voice soft with emotion. "They're not traditional wedding rings, because nothing about our family is traditional. But they represent the same thing: commitment, love, the promise to face whatever comes together." Pearl touched the ring he offered her, noting its simple elegance and the way it caught the light. Engraved inside the band were 3 words: chosen, cherished, family. "Will you marry me?" Boone asked, looking at both women. "Both of you, in every way that matters? Josie legally, Pearl in a ceremony before God and our community, both of you in my heart forever." Pearl felt tears of joy streaming down her cheeks as she slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had been waiting for her all along. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, to all of it." "Yes," Josie agreed, her own voice choked with emotion. "To marriage, to family, to building something beautiful together." The wedding took place 3 weeks later, on a perfect spring day when the Montana sky seemed to stretch forever and the mountains stood like benevolent guardians over their valley. The entire community turned out for the celebration: ranch hands and their families, neighboring ranchers, townsfolk who had come to respect and admire their unconventional family. Dr. Mitchell served as Josie's maid of honor, while Pearl stood as matron of honor, each woman supporting the other in this moment of joy. The ceremony itself was beautiful in its simplicity, Josie and Boone exchanging legal vows before the territorial judge, followed by a blessing ceremony that included all 3 of them, conducted by a progressive minister who understood that love comes in many forms. But it was the reception that truly captured the spirit of their celebration. Tables laden with food stretched across the ranch yard. Musicians played everything from classical pieces to foot-stomping reels, and children ran laughing between the adults, while the older folks shared stories and blessed the union. Pearl's students from the school had prepared a special performance, a reading of poetry they'd written about love, family, and the courage to build new traditions. Their words, innocent and heartfelt, brought tears to many eyes and captured something essential about what the 3 of them represented. As the evening wound down and the last guests departed, Pearl found herself standing once again on the porch, but this time flanked by her husband and sister-wife, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. "Do you ever regret it?" Josie asked softly. giving up the conventional life you planned for this unconventional one. Pearl considered the question seriously, thinking about the woman she'd been when she first stepped onto that stage bound for a fictional husband. That woman had been seeking security, respectability, a life defined by others' expectations. The woman she'd become had found something infinitely more valuable: authentic love, genuine purpose, a family built on choice rather than circumstance. "Never," she said firmly, "not for a single moment. This life we've built, this family we've chosen, it's worth every challenge we face to find it." Boone's arm tightened around both their waists. "I keep thinking about that night in the cave, when I found you both. If I'd taken a different route, if the storm had been worse, if any one of a dozen things had been different. But they weren't different." Pearl interrupted gently. "And maybe that's the real miracle. Not that we found each other despite the odds, but that we recognized what we'd found and had the courage to claim it." "Speaking of claiming," Josie said with a smile, "we have news to share. Dr. Mitchell confirmed it yesterday, I'm expecting." The announcement sent joy coursing through Pearl like electricity. A baby, the first of what would surely be many children, to fill the rooms of Calder House with laughter and love. "When?" Pearl asked, already making mental calculations about school schedules and nursery preparations. "Late fall, just before the first snow," Josie replied. "Perfect timing for a cozy winter of getting acquainted." Boone's face was radiant with happiness. "A baby," he repeated wonderfully, as if testing the word. "Our baby." "The first of many, I hope," Pearl added, thinking about the large family they'd all dreamed of. In their unconventional arrangement, children would be treasures shared by all, loved and nurtured by multiple parents who could provide different strengths and perspectives. As they prepared to go inside, Pearl took one last look around the ranch that had become her world. The school where she taught stood ready for tomorrow's lessons. The Women's Shelter Project would break ground next month, providing refuge for others who needed second chances. The cattle grazed peacefully in pastures that stretched toward mountains that had witnessed their transformation from desperate strangers to devoted family. It wasn't the life she'd planned, but it was the life she'd chosen. And in choosing it, she'd discovered that the most beautiful futures often emerge from the ashes of broken dreams, built by hands that refuse to surrender hope and hearts brave enough to love without limits. The quilt hanging in their main room told the story, perfect individual pieces that had found their purpose only when joined with others, creating something more beautiful and stronger than any of them could have been alone. Like their family, it was a testament to the power of love to transform, to heal, to create beauty from brokenness. As they walked into their home together, Pearl smiled at the sound of Josie, humming a lullaby, the first of many she would sing to the children, who would grow up knowing that families come in all shapes and sizes. But love is always love, no matter how unconventional its form. The stars shone down on the Silver Spur ranch, blessing a family that had found its way home to each other through the longest winter night, emerging into a spring that promised new life, new hope, and new possibilities as limitless as the Montana sky.